And when it ended, many Canadian troops came home through Halifax Harbour. And though they were happy to be back with their families, their thoughts were never far from the brothers-at-arms that they had left behind. Bert Harper was one of those vets, and after his return to New Brunswick, he wrote this short story about his experience. Here is the late co-host of As It Happens, Alan Maitland, with the homecoming.
The news that landfall was near went through the troop ship Queen Elizabeth that morning, and in the afternoon of the cool, grey fall day, the rails were lined with Canadian servicemen and women straining to get their first glimpse of land. It was November 1945. The war was over, and it was homecoming for some 6,000 who had served in Europe. Most of us had not seen Canada for several years, and for some, there had been times and circumstances in which there were doubts that this moment ever would arrive. The first sight of Nova Scotia, barely seen as a dark line on the horizon, was an emotional one to each in his own way. In the hours before we entered Halifax Harbour, we settled down to watch and wait on the open decks. The evening meal on the mess decks was not well attended. Mostly, we were content to stand, surveying the coastline, exchanging comment, singing a few songs, and doing all the things that troops in good humour do when they're waiting. Then, as we drew into the harbour, we saw the 2-story high sign on the dock, which welcomed us all. The sign was particularly meaningful for those of us who had served in Northwest Europe, where the main route through the Canadian sector was named Maple Leaf Route. Many long, dusty miles were spent on Maple Leaf up or Maple Leaf down, sometimes apprehensively, sometimes with relief, depending on the direction being travelled at the time. The large sign read Maple Leaf End, the most appropriate greeting we could get. More than a few eyes were damp at the sight. It was the equivalent of the more modern greeting, tie a yellow ribbon. The railings were fully lined to supervise the docking and to wave and exchange shouts with the contingent of people on the dock. Friendly, upraised faces scanned the rows of arrivals, perhaps hoping to see some special person or acquaintance. Troops started to debark that evening, but it was early morning before I went down the gangplank and filed aboard a troop train, which happened to be bound for Toronto. But first I had walked to the front of the train, just to see once again at close range the magnificent engine that would be pulling it. Then, as I found a place for myself on the allotted railway car, certain unforgettable smells, like the lingering odour of stale cigar smoke, and oranges, and familiar sounds like the quiet hiss of steam from the couplings of a train at rest, and the clank-clank of the investigative taps of the brakeman's hammer as he checked the carriage wheels along the length of the train, made me feel that I was really home again. These smells and sounds were not at all unpleasant to me. On the contrary, they were part of my fascination with trains. This attraction to trains began in the early years of my life in northern New Brunswick. My home was a little bungalow, only about 100 yards from a level railway crossing on the main Canadian National Railway line between Halifax and Montreal, in the sprawling village of Atholville. Each day the hoarse, full-throated scream of the whistle and the thunderous roar of the engine and passenger cars of the Ocean Limited and the Scotian announced the time as they passed the house, and freight trains rumbled by day and night. One of my most vivid memories from those years was the sight and sound of those trains, rolling along at 60 and 70 miles an hour, pulled by the monstrous black 200-ton steel engines, billowing a long line of smoke, steam hissing, piston drivers churning beside the rows of large driving wheels pawing at the steel rails. Next to my dad, and perhaps Joe Louis, my greatest hero was the locomotive engineer, high in the engine cab. He was a glamorous and noble figure, one arm resting on the cab windowsill, leaning out to peer forward through the windscreen, wearing goggles and cap, and with one gauntleted hand pulling the whistle cord as he neared the crossing. A wave to the engineer was mandatory, and it usually brought a return wave, sometimes even an extra toot on the whistle, which would make a young heart beat faster with the thrill of being recognized. On freight trains, the brakeman in the caboose also came in for attention and an exchange of visual greetings. Then, in the fall of 1939, Troop trains full of soldiers, sailors and airmen were rolling past on the way to Halifax and overseas. This brought sudden and dramatic realism to a war that had seemed many miles away, and provided a new kind of excitement to all communities along the CNR. The stop nearest my home was 4 miles away at Campbellton, where all trains made a 20-minute stop for maintenance. When a troop train was scheduled, the word usually got out, security notwithstanding, and large crowds would gather at the station to meet, to greet, and to cheer. There were stirring scenes as fresh-faced young men in uniform would crowd the train windows to banter with the crowd, sing songs, exchange addresses, and flirt bravely with the girls. Sometimes a comely young lass would allow herself to be lifted up to the window for a kiss, squealing and protesting daintily amid more cheers and encouragement from the crowd, and a bit of stifled jealousy on the part of some of us local young bucks. Not many months later, many of us were ourselves on troop trains as volunteer soldiers, feeling the heady exhilaration of the times, assuming the status of heroes in waiting, in almost complete ignorance of what might be in store. And now, in 1945, troop trains meant something else. The return of loved ones, neighbors, friends, the youth of the nation. The scenes at stations were more personal and emotional, as a particular passenger would step down from the train into the post-war world. Crowds were smaller and quieter. The war had dragged on for 6 long years, and we were greeted with relief and respect, rather than with the wild enthusiasm of the early war years. The returning troops were also less boisterous. We were more mature and certainly older in every way, intensely happy, relieved, and a bit prideful. As we wound our way through Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, there was lively chatter about passing scenery, card-playing, storytelling, reading, and snoozing. And others just sat quietly, contentedly keeping their thoughts to themselves. I played bridge for the first time. Poker was also popular. The train conductor, a man about my father's age, was obviously pleased to have us aboard, and as he travelled through the train he exchanged pleasantries and watched the card games. I was to get off at Campbellton in the evening, and sometime after dark those who were travelling further west were settling down to spend the night aboard the train. I moved with my kit to the smoking compartment. In between his trips through the train the conductor came in and we chatted. He wanted to know about places I'd been and asked about my family and where they lived. I told him of my interest in trains and my early wish to become a locomotive engineer. He asked if my folks would be meeting me at Campbellton, and I explained that it was unlikely since they didn't know what ship or train I would be on. He pondered that for a moment, and taking a look at his pocket watch, he said, "Well, if they're not there to meet you, you stay on the train and we'll let you off at Atholville." Needless to say, I was very much impressed at this. There was a small unmanned station at Atholville for local trains, but a mainline train would stop only in an emergency. I could not remember such an event. As it happened, I was not met at Campbellton. I stayed aboard as the conductor had suggested, and when the train left the station, he and the brakeman came through the cars and took up position on the platform between my car and the next. I followed along with my kit, and as we neared the Atholville station, the brakeman stood on the lower step and started the slow swinging of his lantern, which signaled to the engineer in the cab about a half-mile ahead, and the train slowed. I wondered then if the engineer might have been one of my heroes, with whom I had exchanged greetings a few years earlier. Soon we could see ahead the scattered lights of my village as we neared the little station. "Do you live near the station, my friend?" the conductor asked. "Oh, about half a mile further on, near the first level crossing," I replied. "It's an easy walk." He smiled conspiratorially. "Well, we'll make it easier. We'll deliver you." And to the brakeman, "Keep her rolling." The brakeman continued waving the train on slowly and signaled a stop when we were right on my familiar crossing. As I turned to thank the conductor, he shook my hand. "Glad we could help you get home a bit faster, lad." Then as he handed me my kit bag, he added quietly, "My boy won't be coming back." The train rumbled on into the darkness, gathering speed. I stood there for a long moment, regretting that I had not found something appropriate to say to him. I turned toward the little bungalow. The lights were still on, and I could see the familiar outline of my dad in the front window as he peered out, shielding his eyes from the light inside to see why the train had stopped, and turning to speak to my mum. And then up the steps I went, and at the door there were surprised shouts and hugs and happy tears, as we tried to squeeze several years of questions and happy irrelevancies into those first few minutes. It was only later, sometime in the early morning, after we had temporarily exhausted stories and greetings, that I thought again, as I have many times since, of that conductor and his silent grief, and of the homecoming that would never take place.
The great Alan Maitland reading The Homecoming, a short story written by Canadian Second World War vet Bert Harper.